Hi, everyone. This is Craig Zelzer back with the Social Change Career Podcast, Season 12, Episode 18. Today, we're talking about building a career at the intersection of money and impact with Andrea Longton. For those who have not joined us before, the podcast is live stream on LinkedIn and YouTube. We really enjoy hearing from people who are watching us, particularly on LinkedIn. Feel free in the comments to let us know where you're watching from, a couple of words about your background, and then throughout the podcast, your questions and comments. This will be converted to a podcast episode, one of almost 150 others of the Social Change Career Podcast with brilliant innovators from all over the world, from innovative finance to humanitarian relief to peace building to social justice activism. So the two requests, if you like the podcast, please consider sharing and rating this episode. And you can go to PCN Global and search across all the other episodes and find us on any major podcasting platform. And please follow Andrea on LinkedIn and also PCDN. So Andrea is an award-winning author and professional social justice investor. I love that phrase. She has raised over $1 billion for social justice investments in the US and has advised another $1.5 billion worldwide. In addition to her professional experience, she manages her family finances, including their own social justice investment portfolio. She has worked for a wide variety of impact finance organizations, including Opportunity Finance Network, Freddie Mac, Capital Impact Partners, which is now Momentus Capital, and Delphos International. She holds the Chartered Financial Analyst Charterholder designation from the CFA Institute, that is a mouthful,
It is.
and a BA from Centra College in Kentucky, and an MA from the George Washington University. She is the founder and author administrator of the Social Justice Investor website and recent book. So it just came out in April. So we'll put this in the notes, but please check out the book. It's an amazing resource, and the podcast. I think there's 3 seasons so far. And co-host of the podcast Renegade Capital, the activist podcast for finance and investments. She lives in Maryland with her husband and 3 children who are also into soccer. I'm based in Medellin, Colombia, with a very competitive soccer player. I'm only 13, but they won last night. And Andrea, thank you so much for joining us and for taking time out of your schedule. And again, for people watching live, please let us know in the comments a bit about yourself. And so, Andrea, when you think about your career, and I don't necessarily have to go back to being a child, but like a teenager, did you always have this interest in money and impact, or did you, think about becoming a doctor, an astronaut? So where did the money and impact come from?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me on your show. I really appreciate it and delighted to talk to your audience and folks who are listening in. My interest in money and finance and development started when I was in college. When I was growing up, money was a taboo subject. Social justice was a taboo subject, and so we didn't talk about it at all. And as I was studying international relations in college and I was focusing on economic development, noticed that money makes a big difference. And we could see where money flowed, countries flourished. And where money didn't flow, countries didn't flourish. And then we saw that through to how it impacted people on the ground. And so that's really where I started learning more about money and finance. I then went to grad school at George Washington University in Washington, D.C., and really dug in finance and economic development. Still focused on international fields at that point. Got super lucky, got an amazing internship at Delphos International where I had to dig in deep on finance very quickly and catch up on some things that I didn't know to the point where I was building out financial models for huge development projects in emerging markets. And so then I just kept digging in on the finance until I felt comfortable saying, you know what, I do know finance. I got the CFA charter holder just to make sure that I knew my stuff backwards and forwards and was able to apply that to impact investing.
Wonderful. And thinking back to your work in international development and finance, can you just talk a little bit about, one of the things I'd like to discuss is that, the global economy is somewhere 80 trillion plus. The legal economy, if you add in the black or gray market, it's much larger. International official overseas development assistance, 150 billion, just from the OECD DAC members. So just talk about what does it mean where, if you think about finance and international development, does that include loans and investments and, just a little about the scope and an example of a project or two, where you provided assistance or leadership around financing?
My background was mostly in fixed income, so loans into development projects in sub-Saharan Africa, so energy development projects in sub-Saharan Africa, and telecom in the Middle East. And so I remember one very transformative project for me where I've always been focused on outwards, meaning internationally, not US based finance in college and grad school. And so I was working on this $50 million telecom deal in Afghanistan, where we were trying to consolidate and expand the telecom towers there. So there's broader communication range. And this was 2011, 2012. So we're working on that, building out this giant financial model, pitching it to different financial institutions, international financial institutions. I was based in DC at the time. And I learned so much. I mean, I learned a lot across the board as a consulting firm. So you had dozens of different projects you were working on. But for this particular one, I really started to dig in on the on-the-ground financing, and more than just the numbers in a spreadsheet, but how, let's go beyond the assumptions, let's go beyond the formulas, and what does it mean to have an on-the-ground successful project, not only for the investors who were putting in debt capital, and there was some equity investment from a third party, but what it meant to make this successful off the ground. And this was the first place that I really learned that for a development finance project to be successful, you have to have buy-in and consensus from people on the ground, so that impact a community, in order for a project to be successful. And the example for this project that I learned was security was a huge risk for any time that you invest in deals in Afghanistan. Again, this was 2011, 2012. The U.S. was still in Afghanistan and was starting to transition out. With the benefit of retrospective history, we understand that was a lot. There are a lot of lessons learned at that point, and the financing was very fraught with risk. And so one of the big risks to address was security on the ground, making sure that there were physical towers that we see everywhere here where the telecom equipment sits on top of. And so making sure that they were secure, no one was going to climb them and throw off the telecom equipment. And so the question was, do we hire security forces to come in and sit on the ground at these telecom towers, which just didn't make sense from a common sense perspective. But that was what was being talked about until someone said, I've done a lot of these. You want to ask the community if they'll hire folks from the community to guard the telecom towers, because then you have economic buy-in from the community. They feel like they're part of things, and it's not an othering experience for folks on the ground. And that was brand new for me to think about. That had never really been discussed before, is how do we get on the ground buy-in? And that's something that I've really taken with me from that project onwards, as I learned more about impact investing, social justice investing, to always listen to communities on the ground. That is not an international issue. That's an everywhere issue where people need to feel connected and listened to in order for an investment in that community to be successful.
Wonderful example. And I'm on the advisory board of Collaborative Development Associates, and their founder, Mary Anderson, wrote the book Do No Harm, How Aid Can Impact War or Peace. And that's, it's one of the principles that, it's not just her idea, but really in the development and humanitarian industry, is anytime a resource, whether it's human or financial, is introduced into a setting, the idea is that, it could be neutral, but often people in the development or finance industry assume we're doing good and everything's going to be wonderful. And that's not always how it's perceived by communities, sometimes rightfully and sometimes not rightfully. So the idea is that conflict lens is when someone is intervening in your own community or elsewhere, just like what are the potential negative and positive impacts, who's potentially, they also call connectors and dividers, who's potentially in favor. So, that's really critical. And I think, I also worked at International Alert a little bit, and they do a lot of work on business and finance. And, so it's one of the principles. For people who may not be familiar with international development financing, we're not going to do a finance lesson, but a little bit just like, what are the different mechanisms, and how does a project, like whether it's the towers in Afghanistan or, or some other development project, a little bit like, does someone come up with an idea, a government minister, a community leader? So it's like some example, just so obviously it's different by different projects, but how does the idea generate? And then how does it go through the pipeline of, hey, maybe there's not enough resources domestically, or there is, and and what is just public investment versus, international assisted investment?
Yeah, I can speak from my experience on this, which is limited. There's such a huge breadth of different projects that are going on, and a lot of it's impacted by policy of how the money is flowing or not flowing. So what I was based in DC, and so it's a company town. So a lot of this is influenced by federal policy and different institutions based in DC and where their geographic footprints are in different countries. So where they're lending and to what they're lending. And so at the time, there was a big emphasis on renewable energy projects in Africa. It was an initiative called Power Africa. And so my company at the time, Delphos International, would work across the board, either on projects that were ready to be financed. And so supporting projects on the ground, usually sometimes supporting government agencies. And how do we build out a financial model for this in a loan product that's going to work for all the different parties involved? And so that's usually where I came in. But if I go back from ideation of what do we need, for, again, DC based, it was Power Africa, and therefore how are we identifying generative energy generation and transmission in these countries. So for instance, I worked on a hydropower project in Cameroon, which is a country in West Africa. And for that, it was the government of Cameroon pitched the idea to the U.S. USTDA Trade and Development Agency. Excuse me, I'm very acronym focused in Alphabet City. And so they pitched the idea that this is what we want. And then there was a feasibility study of, is this possible? And so then because it went through a U.S. government agency, worked with different companies, both based in the U.S. and also local partners on the ground in Cameroon, from engineering to the energy segment to law for the legal aspect of the power purchase agreements and all the other agreements that I can't remember right now, and also the financing of it. And so then we will work, is this something that is possible? How do we put this together? And then put a plan in place for how do we get this from point A to point B. Then the government of Cameroon in this case, would work alongside the US government to see, can we finance this together? It was a federal policy that this is a mutual interest of both the US government and the government of Cameroon to have more electrification in Africa, and particularly through renewable energy resources. And so then there are a host of different international financial institutions in DC, Washington, DC, and also private financial institutions like private banks who don't have to be based in DC and don't even have to be based in the US, of how do we get this off the ground. And so it's really a collaborative partnership across governments for this particular case, and also private parties too. As many times as we can have a public-private partnership, PPP, as possible, that is always the goal. But working in DC, there's a lot of focus on how can the federal government really support. And so a lot of it was working with US government agencies as well.
Okay. Thank you so much. And then can you talk a little bit, you transition from more assisting with supporting research and financial modeling around international development projects to how did you transition domestically? And then any advice, whether someone starts on more domestic issues in their country and wants to go international, or starts more global and wants to, because I found often it's hard to go both ways. I mean, so I know people who've spent most of their career working outside their country and they want to come back, unless it's like DC or Boston or Geneva, it's hard. But also people who do domestic work, and then it's harder to get that first position or consultancy that connects to international.
Yeah, I think your network is a lot there of building relationships and friendships across the board. So if you know that you might want to go into a different geographic focus, to start making friends on different projects, start building out networks and relationships. And that's whenever you want to make a big switch like that, often you have to lean on those relationships to help you bridge that gap. That's one thing that I'm really glad that I did focus on a lot throughout my career, is how do I continue to make friends, even along the edges and in the margins, because those friends.
I want to interrupt a second there.
Sorry.
because you said along the edges, along the margins,
Sure.
and there is research that shows, I forgot which university, that often it's the weaker links, not the super distant links, but it's not your first degree connections, but kind of that often will help professionally. So just what you mean by kind of on the margins or on the edges, and then any tips for, because DC can be a very transactional city. Not all cities are, but it's funny because, I've lived around the world and been in Colombia almost 7 years. And my wife, Catalina, we did our PhDs together, and she used to call DC, it's like friendship by appointment. And then she would also, I don't want to claim. And the other thing, she would call it project parties. So if someone had a party, the first thing most people ask is, what do you do?
Yeah.
And, a lot of other countries, like people don't talk about, for example, we were talking about football, soccer. I spend so much time with these soccer parents because this team's very competitive, and I kind of have a sense of what people do, but most people don't talk about their work. So just any thoughts both on like the networking and transactional and on the edges and margins?
Yeah, that's so true. DC is definitely a transactional city in many ways. It's very possible to make good friendships there. But I recently moved from close into DC to farther away from DC. And the number of times that I have to like close my mouth and bite on my tongue so I don't say, and what do you do? Because it's just such a way of life. And then you get outside the city and people are like, that's kind of rude. And so it just, yes, absolutely, that resonates. But so when I talk about friendships and on the margin, you work with your project partner, right? And so somebody that you work with day in and day out, those are going to be really strong first degree relationships. But also if you're looking for a new job, sometimes those are really awkward relationships to be able to ask for help and reaching out because they work with you day to day. And it's hard whenever you want to find a new job to tell your existing job, hey, I'm looking. That's just a really awkward conversation unless you're super close with that person. And professional relationships are different than personal relationships. And I think that's always important to remember. So when I'm talking about on the margins, it's people you meet along the way. Maybe you meet somebody at a party and you say, really nice to meet you. And then you see them again in another thing. And so you just keep introducing yourself, waving hi, making sure to stop over and learn more about them. Because it's a small world. And often you see the same faces over and over again, even if you don't work with them, even if you know that you're not going to have a transaction with them, reach out, say hi, because those are especially helpful because they're on the edges, which means when you are looking, you don't have to feel awkward about it. You can say, hey, whatever's going on, and you don't even have to share whatever's going on, but I'm starting to explore other opportunities. Do you happen to know of anybody that's looking? And can you put the word out that if anybody's looking, can they keep my name in mind? And you just kind of raise your flag for looking for work. It's a much less awkward way, but you do have to be really proactive. And it's easy to be in that DC bubble sometimes of I work with this person, we're tight, and then you kind of ignore everybody else. And that's one thing that you have to step away from and make sure to make friends with people. I'll even send follow-up notes to folks and just a lot of times I send waving hi notes of just, hey, just reaching out to wave hi, hope you're doing well, and staying in touch that way.
Thinking about hiring, can you talk both, being a job applicant, what you think has made the difference in your career, and then if you've played a role in hiring for job seekers, whether it's focused on innovative finance or something else, just if you have any data saying you helped recruit for a role and you had X number of applications, and how did it go from X number of applications to the, let's say 5 or 3% that actually got serious consideration and lessons for others?
Yeah. So if you're asking about what makes an applicant stand out, I think really going in knowing my most recent positions for the past 10 years were at nonprofits. And so financial institutions focused on social justice investing, on community development finance. And for those organizations, it's going in knowing the mission of that organization and demonstrating, A, you know the mission, and B, why you are connected to that, why it is important to you, and being able to voice those clearly and being genuine about that if it's a good fit for you, right? If it's not a good fit, it's not a good fit. But if it is a good fit for you, then demonstrating that's the number one thing right off the bat. So if you go in and you have an awesome resume, if you have all the technical skills, but there's a disconnect between you and the mission, you're going to get cut pretty quickly unless there's an extreme need for that technical skill. But even still, it's not going to be a good culture fit, and you might be it might not be a good fit even once you're in the company. So that's the number one thing for nonprofits. It's knowing the mission and resonating with that mission and being able to express that. Beyond that, networking, again, is really helpful if you can have somebody put in a good word for you, that they've known you, that they've worked with you. That goes a long way. Whenever you're hiring somebody from a piece of paper in an interview, it's not really, as somebody who's hiring, that's not really reflective of the person. It's a piece of paper. It's what you're able to present in an interview. And it's always a risk that how someone presents himself in an interview or in a resume does not reflect the person who's going to be sitting at that desk day by day and how they interact with other people. And so if you do have a mutual friend between the person who's hiring or even somebody at the company who's willing to say, hey, I've worked with this person, I can vouch for them, they've done a great job, I'm happy to be a recommendation, that goes a really long way to be able to say this person is going to be great from day to day in the job. And I think a lot of people get intimidated of reaching out to a network and saying, hey, can you put in a good word for me? I don't get asked that very often. I don't know a lot of people who do. And so if you do find somebody who's willing to put in a good word, reach out. And because I'll always pass it along and do my best to put your resume on top of the stack. And I know everybody else will too. But for whatever reason, it seems like it's intimidating. I know I've made the call before and it is very intimidating, but do it because it really goes a long way.
So just two follow-up things.
Yeah.
If you are asked to either do an informal, hey, this person's amazing, and I mean, for this job or opportunity, what is the way you like to be asked, or to make it as easy as possible?
Oh yeah.
Because I'll just give it. I get, I do get asked a lot, both from students and others. And I mean, I have my criteria, but like if someone asks you, like, it should spark joy. Like, hey, like, there should be like one, obviously, as the connector or potential informal endorser, that person A really could match this job opportunity. And so when someone asks, like, what is your advice, how to make that spark joy in the referrer?
Yeah, absolutely. Reaching out politely and kindly is always really helpful, even if you might not even know the person that well, right? So if you know the person really well, then it's maybe a text and a phone call or an email saying, hey, this is what's going on. I'd really appreciate it if you could put in a good word for me. And then something that makes it so much easier for someone to refer you is if you write something down that they can just forward on. So if you write a really nice note in an email that says, hey, I'd really like to have a position at the company that you're with. I think that you all are amazing. I love your mission, and here's why. Here's my skill set. Here's what I could bring to the table. Could you please pass this along to the hiring manager if you feel so? Then all that person has to do is forward it and say, hey, this person is great. I worked with them at X, Y, or Z. Hope that you can consider them along the way. So if you can make it as easy for the person as possible, that's great. If you don't know the person well, like maybe you've had a couple of conversations, but that's it. Offer like, hey, can I reach out to you for 10 minutes? I'm looking at a job at your company, and I'd really like to have your expertise or your insights into this, if it's a good position for me or not. Keep it capped at 10 minutes so it's not a big lift for the person that you're calling, and just have an informal conversation. And the trick with that is to not be abrasive whenever you ask them, especially if you don't know them well, because they know what you're calling about. You know what you're calling about. And so everybody knows what's going on. And so if you can learn first and then say, I think I'd really be interested in this role. I think I'd be a good fit. Do you mind if I sent you a note that you could forward along to the hiring manager? I'd really appreciate that. And it's done. The person doesn't have to help you. But if you make it easy for them, it's much more likely that they're going to forward that email along.
Yes. Yeah. I think that's brilliant advice. The one other thing I would add is be prepared for the person to say no, or just not. I would say like 80, 90% of the time when I get asked, I think there's a match, but sometimes the person's asking and it's like, it's not a match. Like, who knows? And then it's very awkward to make an intro or a connection. And then the other thing is follow up, whether you get it or not. Like, and obviously I'm thinking more PhD applications, how many letters I've written. It's just nice to say, hey, I got this, or I didn't get it, or you don't have to say anything, but just if you're asking someone to devote a little bit, it's also just nice to know. But
absolutely.
So can you talk a little bit about domestic, so nonprofits working on financial ecosystem support and community development, finance institutions, and just in the US, what does that mean? And what is the difference between working an opportunity finance network versus working for a big bank or a Wall Street firm? And, obviously you've worked for, both really large ones and smaller ones. So just a little bit, how do you categorize your engagement with finance as a professional, and then eventually get to social justice investing?
Yeah, there is a huge ecosystem of community development financiers in the U.S. There are community loan funds in, I'm pretty sure, all 50 states. There are credit unions and community banks spread all throughout the country. And there's venture capital firms. There are angel investors. There's crowdfunding. There are green banks now. There's a whole ecosystem and network of financing that's out there and available. In many ways, it feels outside of mainstream capital, meaning big banks, Wall Street firms, where you see a lot of zeros and a lot of commas of the amount of money that's flowing through. But whenever you're talking about a small business on the ground, they don't need, 6 zeros and an account. They might need $50,000. And that's a huge number for a lot of small businesses and can be transformative in their success. So there is this ecosystem of different financial veins that go to small businesses, home ownership, schools, healthcare facilities, community facilities, all these community assets that any person or community needs to reach their full potential. And if that money doesn't flow, then we see those communities don't flourish. But if the money does flow, then there's so much more potential and active community building and wealth building in those communities. And so the first thing is to get involved, to get plugged in where you want to go. So I was lucky enough to be able to work for Capital Impact Partners, which is based in Arlington, Virginia. And that's a larger CDFI. So a CDFI is a community development financial institution, and that's based in the U.S. They're usually community lenders, so they can also be banks, credit unions, or venture capital firms. But about 50% are loan funds. So I was lucky enough to be hired there at the right place at the right time under the right person, and learned a lot about community investing. But there are small ones, there's big ones. And the best thing to do is you can go to OFN's website, Opportunity Finance Network, ofn.org. They have a Find a CDFI near me, plug in your zip code, and you will find a few to check out. And then reach out for an introduction or connect if they are hiring. And so usually it's just calling up and saying, hey, I'm really interested in a position. Where can I learn more? And going from there. And so they lend into communities that sometimes are disconnected from mainstream capital sources. If a bank is not located in a state or headquartered in a state, so Mississippi does not have any banks headquartered in the state. It's outside of any bank's jurisdiction or obligation to have to lend there. And so communities in Mississippi cannot rely on financing from big banks because they're not obligated to lend there. And so instead you have an alternative network of community investors who do. And so that's like Hope Credit Union is a big one in Mississippi that lends into communities into the state. Those are a great place to get connected. They look at they are mission aligned and mission dedicated to serving low-income communities, to serving communities of color, to serving immigrant communities, different groups that have historically been disconnected from mainstream capital sources. It's a great place to get connected and learn more. The other great part of those is that you have to learn on the ground. The most successful way to interact with small businesses, affordable home ownership, healthcare facilities who have been disconnected from mainstream capital sources and therefore don't always operate in the same way as those organizations who are really well plugged into mainstream capital sources. So one thing I learned sitting at a CDFI is that folks would often have to come in with folks with a really strong financial background and traditional financial background, and then have to unlearn a whole lot of that financial procedure, policy culture in order to make successful loans into community, where the financial fundamentals are the same. You loan money in order to get your principal back. and with some interest, right? So the financial fundamentals of lending money are the same, but how you make those loans in order to get the principal back is very different. There is a middle ground between predatory lenders and Wall Street, and that's where CDFI sit and navigate.
So can you talk a little bit about, obviously financial institutions need to at least get their capital back plus cover operating costs.
Yeah.
And so I've talked to impact investors. Not in my mind, I know what kind of return we look for. I mean, we're very small investors, but does a community financial development institution look for, whatever the rate is plus 3%, while maybe a predatory lender might look for 10%? Like, obviously it varies, but what is some guidance where you would say it's a healthy and realistic non-exploitative rate of investment return,
Yeah.
versus like kind of crazy versus like run away because this is just insane?
Yeah. It depends on the asset class, right? So, and we're going to kind of walk through a few different examples, and these are hypothetical placeholders, and it really depends on what the interest rate market is at the time. But affordable housing, you can usually have a lower margin than small business. So on an affordable housing, a CDFI or a community development financial institution lending to an affordable housing developer might need a 3% margin in order to then have principal conservation plus enough revenue from interest in order to cover overhead and to cover all of their different costs. Whereas a community lender lending money into a small business does need a higher margin in order to be able to cover the cost of a more hands-on experience to be a successful small business owner. So then you might be looking at an 8% interest rate margin. Hypothetical, again, different. Community lenders are really good at being able to collect a lot of different sources of capital to reduce that cost and to buy down that interest rate margin. And so I'm talking placeholders. And then you jump into predatory lending where you might be looking at 100% interest rate if you look at all in of everything that's going in on top of a bunch of fees. And so it would be great to not have an 8% loan or even 11% loan going out to a small business. But it's a lot better than that 100% loan. And it also, if you dig into the business model of that community lender, there's a lot of free business advice and consulting that goes into that also has to be covered.
Okay. We've invested in, there's a community bond issuer called SMBX. There's another one called Honey Credit.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that.
Or Honeycomb, I think, but SMBX we've invested in also, both as angel investors, but also as, putting in, and they generally will do about a 10%, between 9 and 11%.
Yeah.
And they charge like a 3% or origination fee, but it's really focused on community businesses, and some of them are super impact focused. Like we just put not a lot of money, but invested in one that's doing a lot around food sustainability and kind of, in the Northwest. So it's really interesting. So welcome, John from Rochdale Capital, says fan of Andrea. So again, if anyone's watching and you have questions or comments or tips, feel free to put them in the chat and we'll weave them in. So one or two more questions about kind of the finance industry, then we'll move into social justice investing. Yeah. So a lot of people, again, we were talking before we started the podcast, I've been teaching on business and finance for a long time. And for years, people are like, it's interesting, but they didn't want to do it. And business is horrible and development is great. And in my mind, I don't differentiate between like the type of entity anymore, between foundation, nonprofit, for-profit. Like there's good and bad everywhere. But what are some roles, like if someone's not a numbers person or a stats-oriented person or a financial modeler, what other kind of roles are there to work in community-based finance or innovative finance that maybe don't require this hard number approach?
Yeah, absolutely. So many different roles, from communications. How are we telling our story? One thing that I think all community lenders would say is something they would love to improve on is how are we telling our story? How are we getting out there? Because if we can't communicate our value, then it's hard for us to raise capital. It's hard for us to get money in the door that then we can lend out the door, and especially at affordable rates. There are operations. These companies have a lot of money flowing in and out, and making sure, not even from an accounting side, but just from operating, how are we communicating across our loan originators to our loan servicers, to accounting, to the CFO team. And that's just if you're only looking at the money flowing in and out. There's a huge operational need there. There is um, there there are financial roles that are not number heavy, right? So if you are raising capital, a lot of that is going out and writing grant applications, going out and writing credit applications, that then you can work with somebody to tie in the numbers into. So you might work with the accounting part of your team to write, why is this important? How do I raise capital for this? Please, can I have $10 million? Those are really important jobs and roles that don't have to be finance heavy. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. There might also be program officers at the door that do technical assistance on, come in, let's get you sorted. Let me show you how to put in this credit application, because I don't know anybody who's taught in high school, how do I do a credit application, right? That's its own beast. And finance is a lot of forms. At the end of the day, that finance is like 90% forms, 5% numbers. And so if you can help somebody figure out how to complete this form, you're helping them get 95% of the way there. And then once they're there, someone else takes it to the next step. So there are so many different ways that you can get involved. And to go back to something I said earlier, being aligned with the mission will get you so much further than someone who is super number savvy, but isn't aligned with the mission, that wants to take, here's what I learned on Wall Street, and then apply it to Main Street or Side Street, and not be able to make that connection and not be successful. So if you're mission aligned, you can pick up the numbers. I promise the numbers aren't that hard. You keep it plain vanilla. That's where you find success in finance, especially in community lending. Keep it plain vanilla across the board, because then you can communicate to your investors what you're doing. You can communicate to the community what you're doing, and the borrower what you're doing. If you can keep it simple, it's so much easier to share your story and share why it's important.
Wonderful. And then we talked about helping kind of allocate or invest, or $1 billion domestically or $1.5 billion domestic internationally.
Yeah.
What are some ways you'd like to tell that story in terms of, obviously you're part of a team, but the money that's been invested, allocated, what are some aggregate numbers, like X number of jobs created or communities improved or people have access? Like, what are some of your favorite data points or stories around that?
As a financial person, it's hard to start with a story, because we have been trained that we need to rely on numbers and data. And I break that rule and I rely on stories. I have the numbers and data in my back pocket. I can give you an impact report. I can give you a spreadsheet of different information, but people forget data and numbers very quickly, very, very quickly. Stories stay with people. And so I share borrower stories. If I can get a video in front of somebody, that makes a huge difference, even if it's 2 minutes. I share, one of my favorite stories is a story from my home state, Kentucky. And it is a story of a community center in Appalachia. And Appalachia is a place where, when I grew up and visited family there, recycling is a dirty word. And anything that has to do with climate change cannot be discussed, at least when I was growing up there. And so I about fell out of my chair when I saw this amazing story about a community facility who installed solar panels on their roof in the middle of coal country, and what an impact it made on its community and its economic drive in that community, where it reduced its energy costs from like $2,000 a month to $200 a month. Which enabled it to continue having free broadband internet, which is a big deal in a place that doesn't have broadband internet in every house and hardly any houses. And so to be able to sit in the parking lot and use it for free, to have daycare centers that run out of there, to have they had a pizza restaurant that hired formerly incarcerated workers. It's a big deal in Appalachia. And to have it be, to flip this narrative on its head and to be able to say, yeah, we have solar panels and we're really happy about it, is such a powerful message to be able to deliver people of why this impacts the community in such a positive way, not only from a social justice, but from a climate justice point of view, and tie it together with an economic justice story. That sticks with people. And then they look and go, okay, well, how do we scratch this out on the back of the envelope? Now give me the numbers. How does this filter in? But I start with stories, because studies show that people will remember that. People forget the number as soon as you tell it to them.
Amazing. So if you can share maybe the name of that
Yeah.
let's say, so there is an interesting startup called Climatize. Again, we're not offering financial advice. I'm mentioning some organizations. So anywhere you put your money, you could potentially lose it. And I'll tell a story about that in a second. But Climatize is relatively new, and they're similar to SMBX. You're doing direct investments into community-based solar projects, often in rural areas, and you can get a pretty good return. Of course, you can lose the money. And I'll just say one example. I mean, my wife had relatives in Lexington. So I've been to Kentucky a few times. I don't know the state. And there was a really good publicly traded company called App Harvest, which was a B corporation, B corporation triple bottom certified, and they were building these large scale organic greenhouses in Appalachia to help, not just people in the coal industry, but people who often coal industry help them transition to organic farming. And I was like, this company is amazing. It's a B Corp. And I didn't put a lot of money in, but I invested, and the company went bank, publicly traded, great mission, and they failed. So I'm just saying, like, that's one of the things, like, the story was great. I don't know. Again, I didn't do a deep dive to know how much was bad business model, how much was like supply chain cost, labor. But so switching to, before we get into social impact investing, when you think about community finance development institutions or just community lending, there's all different kinds, but is the failure rate or default rate any higher? Or, obviously it depends what you're talking about, but that's one of the big arguments. Like, is it more risky, less risky, or the default? Is there an average tolerable default rate across the asset classes?
Yeah. So the numbers that I have off the top of my head are for community development loan funds. And this is, I no longer work at OFM, but my job there was investor relations. And so being able to talk through this. And at the time, and so you want to make sure that the research is still fresh. But during COVID, there was a major concern among investors that all of these small businesses are going to go bankrupt. All of these affordable housing, all are going to go bankrupt. All of these places that CDFIs and community lenders invest in are going to go bankrupt. And therefore, the lenders, the CDFIs, are going to go bankrupt. There was a huge, huge concern at the beginning of COVID about this. And so the opposite happened, where the default rate for CDFIs decreased to 0.48% in 2020, whereas banks' default rate was 0.058% during the same time period. And these are community loan funds, and so they're doing fixed income. They're not doing equity for the most part. A couple do. And it came down to knowing your customer. And so are you connected with your customer? How are you making sure that your customers have the financing that they need? How do we talk to them about, hey, nobody's coming into your shop right now because it's COVID and you can't get out of the house? How do we restructure your payment? How do we get a pause on payments right now and backload them into the end of your loan? This was extremely common for community lenders who are really focused on how do we make sure that our communities continue to thrive and that they don't lose wealth during this period. And so we saw the opposite. So huge concern going in. And then CDFIs flipped it and said, no, we've got our communities back. We're going to figure this out. And it also went back to talking to the community, figuring out what they needed, making sure they knew someone was there for them, and then communicating, the CDFI taking that information and communicating it up to their investors, because at the same time, the community lenders had to be repaying their debt to their investors. And so having that chain of different, the flow of financing be aligned on how are we supporting our communities during this difficult time, and having everybody being willing to be flexible in the same way and to continue to be supportive makes a huge difference. Now, if we go back to the Great Recession in 2008, 2009, 2010, we saw that a lot of big banks who were investing in mortgages, usually in rural areas, in lower income areas, in communities of color, were selling their mortgages at cents on the dollars. Like it was a fire sale, right? And so they saw default rates go way up. A lot of really smart community lenders purchased those loans at cents on the dollar and got them to become performing again. And there's one I'm thinking of, and it's Fahi, again, based in Appalachia. I have a little bias towards stories in Appalachia because that's where my family's from. But it's a tremendous organization. It's the Federation of Affordable Housing Enterprises. I probably got something wrong in there, FAHE. And they purchased these MBS, mortgage-backed securities, for cents on the dollars, and got them to be performing. And the banks called them and said, what did you do? We could not get them to be performing. Like, we had totally written them off. How did you do this? And they said, we called them. and said, hey, we're your new servicer. You have to pay us. And they said, hey, we don't have broadband, so we can't use whatever the big bank was using to make those payments online. They said, just call it in. Or just mail it in. Here's the address. And they became performing. And they made a lot of profit off of those sales because they bought them cents on the dollar, which was market rate that nobody wanted to touch. Got them. And then they were able to use that money to buy down interest rates going forward, to be able to invest in new projects, to have money to reinvest in their communities. So to me, investments can go bad all the time, and they do. And that's incredibly important to know whenever you're going as an investor, is your money is not guaranteed. It's just not. We even saw that with Silicon Valley Bank about a year ago in how they were investing, right? And that was an FDIC insured bank. And so we see that. However, if you are working with an organization that is really focused in its DNA of its mission of how are we supporting our communities, they're going to do everything they can to find a way. And if you look at the history of how they perform, it's incredibly successful, even vis-a-vis FDIC insured non-CDFI banks, NCUA insured non-CDFI credit unions. It still tends to be very favorable.
Amazing. Yeah, I mean, that's one of the most important things to understand is diversification. Whether you're an individual investor or a large scale investor or financial institution, and whatever goes up can come down, and diversification across asset class and types. So that's one of the things we teach in our investing class. And again, I've also had money. This is a whole different story, but I'll start moving into social justice investing for the last few minutes. But we put some of our savings into, because we really believe in community banks. So we put, there was South Shore Bank in Chicago, one of the first big community development banks in the US, been around since the 70s. And we're like, we had a local bank, but that was our main savings bank. And then this was probably 2008 at 10 p.m. on a Friday night, we get an email saying your bank's gone. Because of the FDIC, like it wasn't a new bank on Monday.
Yeah.
And we've had something like that happen a couple of times. So it's interesting, and that's one of the challenges investing in countries where the financial institutions aren't as strong, because either super high inflation or no trust in the financial institutions. So they have to find other places money doesn't really have values. They have to find other things. But in terms of social justice investing, first of all, congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
And can you talk about who the audience is? And obviously not to give away all the secrets, because people should buy the book and or listen to your podcast, but who is it directed to, and what are some of your core lessons, let's say for individual investors, particularly our audience who are focused on social impact? Like, what do you hope read the book, listen to your podcast, listen to this one, but what do you hope they start thinking about or start executing differently?
Yeah, the book is called The Social Justice Investor, and it's how to generate wealth while also creating social and climate justice returns, because often that's seen as impossible to do both. And this book lays out how you can have both, but it's about balance and respect. And so the balance of what are my financial returns, what's my target. And my argument is to not chase profits maximization, but rather what is sustainable over the long run. Because when you talk about, we've seen the ups, we've seen the downs, those happen in the stock market all the time. And so how do we select investments that are going to stay stable without having a crystal ball, right? So because we never know, and investments can go very well and can go very poorly depending on so many different factors. But by staying steady on, I want this to be sustainable. I'm not trying to get rich quick. I'm trying to get rich slow. And then the second piece is, how do I layer in social and climate justice returns as a required return? Because right now, if you have an investment policy statement or an IPS, which is your governance document for how you're looking at your investments, social and climate justice returns are usually kept in the bottom of the nice to have pile, known as unique circumstances. But what happens if we pull them out of the bottom of the nice to have pile and put them at the very top of the must have required return? And if we build out an IPS based on that, then how do our decisions look different from how do we hire a financial advisor or even decide if we need one? Or how do we go a DIY route, or how do we go in 401k? So to circle back to the very top of your question, which is who is the audience? It's everyday people. And frankly, even professional social justice investors, because we tend to have a different relationship with our money personally than we do professionally. Or put a different way, we often are better stewards of other people's money than our own. And so how do you start thinking about your own money and how it's invested? If it's a 401k, if it's a DIY, if it's accumulated wealth, how do we take it out of the black box where it's been sitting and really interrogate it and look at it and decide, how do I change this, if you haven't already, moving forward so that it does reflect your values. If you're invested in private prisons, thinking about, I didn't realize I was. How do I think about that? How do I divest in a way that doesn't really hurt me too badly on tax consequences of divesting of investments? If you're invested in fossil fuels, then how do you divest from that and start investing in initiatives, organizations, companies, projects that do align with your values? So everyday investors, even if you are a professional investor, think a little differently about money than they do at their day job.
So we teach a class on investing. We're in the middle now for impact professionals, and when I look at, whether it's environmental social governance or social responsible investing, things in the public markets is different in private markets.
Mm.
I mean, I haven't done quantitative research in this, but I've done a lot of reading and looking. So when I look at ETFs, electronic traded funds, or mutual funds that are classified as ESG, and we do this in exercise in class, and we start looking at the holdings. To me, 98% of everything I see that's labeled as ESG or SRI, whether the same thing is complete crap.
Yeah.
And so, I do think one of my favorite resources, if you're US based, I mean, there's all sorts of proprietary models. Most of them focus on risk management. I really like As You Sow.
Yeah.
If you're based in the US, it's a free resource. They do a lot on shareholder advocacy. And if you have a US ETF or mutual fund, they don't do it for individual stocks. You can put it in there. And it's not perfect, but it'll give you pretty good rankings across what you're talking about: fossil fuels, carbon, prisons, war, but what is your advice? I mean, two questions here. So whether someone's a do-it-yourselfer or they want to use a robo-advisor or a human being, financial advisor, how not to succumb to, there's two things. One is like, they say it's ESG, but then I look and they have Coca-Cola or, or other companies that maybe are good on one thing, but fundamentally destroying the planet. So any advice for how to screen, but also how not just to give up and say like, it's too complicated?
Yeah. There are several chapters in the book that address exactly that, because it is an issue right now. This is in many ways a nascent field. To have authentic on the ground change, and to have, it's not a nascent field in that people have been doing it for generations, but to see it on the public capital markets and to have accessible versions in the private capital markets is relatively new, really within the last 5 to 10 years, and in the public capital markets in the past 3 to 4. And so anytime you're in a new market, you have to kind of shoulder through it and learn some lessons along the way. But there's some really great tools to be able to help you. And the first one is just knowing, is this impact washed? I call it a WISC, WISC, a wolf in sheep's clothing, because it looks great. They tell a great story, but then you dig in, you're like, actually, this is all spin. And I don't think I want to invest in this. And it happens a lot. And so first thing is just recognizing, is it real or not? And the second thing is knowing how to be able to research that. And I talk a lot about As You Sow in the book, but they have a great tool in Invest Your Values. It's free to be able to get an A through F scoring of different investments, of how they're doing in the categories you mentioned. And until we get some really great products that are easily available, knowing how to balance, right? So if you know that this ETF is like a B, am I willing to accept that? Or am I going to wait for an A? And knowing that if you don't accept the B, then you're going to get an F. Or you're going to select something that's an F instead. And so it's doing the best you can where you're at of what's available to keep yourself educated and to keep taking that next step forward. It's not going to be perfect. And investments are messy often. And whenever you're trying to walk a line of balance between sustainable financial earnings and social and climate justice, there's never going to be something where like, yes, this is it. This is awesome because I'm getting a great financial return off of it, or a sustainable financial return, and it has incredible social and climate justice returns. If there's one of those, you will see it everywhere because people are going to be really excited about it. There's some great products out there, but there's always going to be analysts going, it could be better here, and it could be better here, and it could be better here. And good product issuers are going to listen to that and say, you're right. How do we improve upon this? And so my advice is do the best you can with what you have and where you are for as long as you can. Keep educating yourself and keep moving forward, because if the alternative is not doing it, then that's not helpful either. If you can find an easy way or an easy-ish way to do it, that's a great place to start.
Okay. So just one comment and we'll start wrapping up. So
Yeah.
it's funny, I won't say which, investment vehicle, but we have one that to me is very sustainable and green and wonderful. I mean, not perfect.
Yeah.
And close to where we live in Medellin, there's a building and of a particular company that I think is partially owned by this fund.
Okay.
And there's like in Colombia, when there's labor disputes, employees can put things criticizing their employer in the windows of the building. It's like
Okay.
it's really interesting.
Yeah.
So we walk by this building and there's like all these things not criticizing the Colombian company, but also this global company has partial ownership, saying like
Mm,
workers' rights are horrible. So it's just interesting, like
yeah.
even something that I perceive, and I need to do some more research, but like there's often complications. I would say the things that I found the best in the public markets, there are certain ETFs in clean energy, wind,
Hmm.
solar, not water as much because hydro is more damaging, but there's a couple of ETFs that I just think not perfect, but where they, but then the return hasn't been as good as some other ETFs. And then
Yeah.
there's ETFs that are clean energy, but they have some mixed things, but it's challenging.
Yeah.
So to start wrapping up, apart from As You Sow, what are some of your, two questions. What are some of your personal finance, social impact favorite resources?
Hmm.
And then for people who might be considering upskilling around this intersection of finance and impact, any favorite podcast resources, or just, you have a CFA, is it worth, getting certified, or just any thoughts on that?
Yeah. My favorite resource is this book called The Social Justice Investor.
Yes.
Uh, but in all seriousness, in the back, we do have online resources and tools, as well as social justice investment organizations, just so you can keep moving forward with it. Invest for Better is a great company that has circles of education where they go through different fixed income to ETFs to private equity to cash of how you can move your money for better. Um, Addisino Social Capital, I think, is doing great things and really pushing the envelope. And how do we get social justice investments into the public capital markets? Free Cap Financial Inc. is one that was just featured in Fast Company for their decarceration index. Is fantastic. CDFIs, obviously, I'm in love with. And mightydeposits.com is a great one for being able to see what your bank or credit union is doing with your cash while you sleep at night. That one I think is really powerful. Many of us have bank accounts or credit union accounts. And so just knowing that your money is doing good things while you sleep is really powerful, even if you're not in a place where you're ready to invest quite yet. So the other piece that I would say is I feel incredibly fortunate to work in a social justice investment realm where people tend to link arms more than they do elbow each other out of the way. Because I think we all know we have to be able to stick together and partner with each other and shout each other out for great things that are happening. Because nobody has a huge PR budget, right? And so we have to really collaborate with each other to get the word out. And also because that transparency that you mentioned of what's going well, what's not, it's really great to have a group of people who will keep you honest and also point out, hey, this is one area that I've heard whisperings about that could be doing a little better and getting that direct feedback. But also a group that if you get a phone call from someone saying, hey, I'm really interested in this type of investment. Does your company do that? And you might say, unfortunately, we don't. We focus on something else instead, but you should really call this group. And so it's nice to work within that. So I would say if you can just get connected with one organization, it becomes a launching pad to get involved and engaged with the next organization that's closer to what you want.
So last two things. So Hoy, thanks very much. Let us know where you're teaching or your students and any resources. So Andre is based in Poland, and just CFA, what is it? I mean, obviously, and like, what is the time length involved? Is it like
Yeah.
multi-year? And it's really just for people who are going to be working really deep. And Andre has a MBA, so like, what is the advantage or disadvantage of a CFA?
Mm. If you want to work on Wall Street, it's almost you have to have it in order to be able to get the job that you want, an MBA and a CFA. It's a 4-year process to get a CFA charter holder. It is a mouthful. Under the ethics portion of the exam, you are taught how to say it exactly. And it's 3 years of exams, and you have to pass them, and you have to have 4 years of professional experience. So if you want to work on Wall Street, it is absolutely, you have to have it in order to be successful. Or I would say most people say it helps a lot in being successful in that field. You probably don't have to have it. But in the social justice investment world, I had to be very careful of what I was learning in that formal education and then really thinking through the fundamentals of it and how it could be applied differently to be successful in social justice investment. It's a very different culture than social justice investing world. I'm personally really glad that I have it because sometimes social justice investing isn't seen as the powerhouse player in a conversation. And so being able to have that credential signals that I, in fact, do know my way around finance and that this isn't just silliness. It comes back with those credentials. So the credentials are useful to have. Whether or not you use them every day depends on what field that you're in precisely.
Okay. And then last question is what kind of assistance you're potentially looking for. So please check out the book, a little bit about your podcast. So is it seasonal, where people can find it, and the best channel to follow you on? Is it LinkedIn or a newsletter or something else?
Yeah, the best channel to follow me on is LinkedIn. That's where I stay most engaged. And I'm also on Instagram and Facebook, but I would strongly recommend LinkedIn. You can purchase The Social Justice Investor anywhere where books are sold. If you want to go through a local independent bookstore, bookshop.org is a great place to start. There's also a great group called Tertulia. It's a cooperatively owned bookstore that I was able to partner with for a few months and hopefully can continue that discount moving forward. And the Renegade Capital podcast is the activist podcast for finance and investments. You can listen to episodes wherever podcasts are streaming. It is seasonal. We finished up 3 seasons. I co-host that with Leah Freemount and Ebony Perkins. And we tackle questions around community development finance and impact investing, social justice investing. Our focus is how do we talk about the topics that are the hard ones and in a way that has not necessarily gone through any spin, right? Because sometimes you talk about things and you want to get to the bottom of it, but there's a certain way that you have to talk through things. And so it's real talk about investments in finance and how they contribute to justice in our country and sometimes how they don't. And so we get into some good conversations there.
Wonderful. So thank you so much, Andrea, for generously sharing your time and joining us. And please follow Andrea on LinkedIn, check out the book, recommend to others, check out the podcast. I just came across it, so I'm going to start listening. And I'll mention one other podcast I love that is Capital Isn't at the University of Chicago.
Oh, yeah.
It's a University of Chicago economics professor, and obviously Chicago tends to be more conservative economics, and a journalist, Bethany, I forgot her name, but it's really, they question stuff in a good way. So I think and obviously there's one also from the UN. I'm going blank. The UN the Capital Development Fund has a really good one too. Anyway, it'd be interesting to see also your other favorite podcasts. And please consider rating and listening to Andrea's podcast and ours, because podcasts are a labor of love. And the best thing we can hear is if you share it and help amplify it. And this will be out as a podcast episode on Friday. Thank you, everyone, for listening now or in the future. And Andrea, thank you for all you do. And Andrea and Hoy and everybody else who's been listening, wherever you are in the world, thank you so much for your energy and wisdom. And have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful.